Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. My name is Stéphane Jaillet. I'm the CEO of Offence, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today for the second episode of the webinar series talking about cyber defense. I'm glad today to have Martin, CTO of Enclose and co-founder, with us today. Thank you for being with us. How are you, Martin, today?
Good. Thanks, Stefan. It's good to be here, and thanks for having us. Always good to do sessions with you guys.
Great. So before starting, let me tell you just a few words about us. Offence and Enclose are very similar companies. We both have been providing cybersecurity for more than... Oops, sorry about this. Both companies have been providing cybersecurity for more than 13 years now. Enclose in South Africa and Offence in Réunion Island on mainland France also. I met Martin in 2015, I think, on a trade fair in Cape Town, AfricaCom. And then for the last 3 years now, we have been working together, specifically for providing audits, vulnerability assessments, and penetration testing. And now our collaboration is going on around the SOC and MDR services. So we are aiming at providing a 24/7 service in the Indian Ocean based on the sharing our tools on team. And talking about teams, this will be more efficient since Helix Security has joined Exodata group now, like Offence 2 years ago. And so Helix will join the team in Mauritius. So today we have Serge with us. Thank you for being here, Serge. How are you today?
Fine, thank you, Stefan. Glad to be here with you guys. Have a nice session.
Yeah, great. Okay. So just before starting, I will give the hand to Martin. Please feel free to use the Q&A button to ask questions during the presentation, and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. I think it's better to do like this. And also let me inform you that this webinar is recorded, so I will send you the replay later. And you will be able also to receive the first episode replay also. So I think it's now time to dive into today's subject, which is defense is the new offense. So Martin, I think it's up to you now.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Let me just share my screen quickly.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure. Is the right screen showing there, guys?
Yes. It's still gray, but I think it takes just a few seconds to appear.
Just try it again. Has it come through yet, or is it still gray?
Not yet.
Let me just try that again. Second time is sometimes a charm. If that doesn't work,
it's still gray, but I think I can see your mouse on the left top corner.
What I'll do is I will just share the actual desktop.
Yeah.
And we'll see if that works a little bit better.
It's coming. Yeah.
Is that a little bit
better? Yes, but it's too small. Can you zoom in? Yeah, perfect.
All right.
It's working now. Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
Cool.
All right. Always those technical challenges before the start of the presentation. Thanks for that introduction, Stefan. We're gonna talk about defense is the new offense today. It's not a very sales-oriented presentation, if I can put it that way. It's more informative, so I hope you enjoy it. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Stefan did a very good introduction, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. I'm a techie at heart. I call myself a techie at heart. I've been doing technical from the start of my career, as many of us in IT started doing desktop support, helping the grandpa and the grandma get onto the internet and send the emails. And from there, we evolved to do greater things. I've been in security for almost 20 years now, and I co-founded Enclose, as Stefan mentioned, about 13 years ago. And for the last 5 years, I would say, maybe a little bit more, we've been developing our MDR solution, which is like a managed security operations center. And this is very close to this topic I'm going to be talking about today, and I'll try to illustrate those where this ties into our topic today. And I've got a Twitter account there. I'm not very active, but you're welcome to follow me. And of course, you can email asking any questions if you have questions at any point. So I wanted to start off about when we talk about offense and defense, it's very closely tied to cybersecurity. And when we think about offense, we think about running audits, etc. And really, it's quite nice because offense, you generally have very much creativity in terms of what you're able to do. So even when we talk about doing audits, but also about any type of attackers, they don't have any rules. It's almost like a criminal gang, and in many cases, it is criminal gangs that orchestrate these attacks. But they have complete creativity. They can do whatever they please. They have no rules. They can be sneaky. And all of this sounds very appealing to most people, especially young people that come into cybersecurity. And you'll find that many of the people that we speak to and many of the people that we interview, the young people getting into the industry, they find this quite appealing, and they want to get certifications in the offense side of things. And they really see their careers developing in cybersecurity on the offense side. And I think that this is somewhat changing now. And I think the reason, if we look at the defense side, or what we call the blue side often, the reason people don't want to go into that is because they often see vendor limitations. So as opposed to creating your own defenses, you often have to rely on vendors that sell products, and you have to use their products to help you defend. For many of us that are in any organizations that have controls and processes in place, you will know about change control, and we all love change control. It saves us many times, but it also adds a lot of red tape. And often there's a battle between and this doesn't refer just to change control, but just in terms of business, there's a battle between the cyber defenders and business in terms of implementing security controls. So we always want to implement security controls to help defend our organization, but this needs to go through change control. and we get fight back. The user experience can't be changed too much, and it becomes very difficult to do our job. So we're always trying to find a compromise there. And then lastly, if you think about defenses and implementing defenses, this is probably a problem that all of us have, and it's going to get worse in the next couple of months as this lockdown situation and this pandemic affects us all, and our budgets will get squeezed. And so when we have to make decisions around defense, much of it is guided by our budgets that we have available. So it's very difficult, and it doesn't sound as creative if you look at it from this perspective. And that's why we believe that most people, when they go into cybersecurity career, choose the offensive side. And so I looked at this, and it's kind of disappointing when you go interview after interview, and people just want to say no, they want to become a pen tester, but actually we want to change the thinking around that. And so this is one of the reasons why I put this slideshow together, to change the thinking around that and let people know that we can make defense as interesting again. So really, this is what we want to do. And I think if you look at all the organizations, or typically the founders or the thought leaders around penetration testing, if you look at Kevin Mitnick, here in South Africa, we have an organization called SensePost that have been around for over 20 years. All these organizations, the leaders of those organizations were originally pen testers, and you see many of them are actually doing defense now. So I'd like to think that they've realized that defense is as interesting. It's actually more challenging than offense in many cases. And I think we need to think differently and think progressive around applying many of the techniques that the offensive actors and the people specializing in offense, the techniques that they use, we need to apply those into defense. And I really think that that's possible. And I want to show a quick slide to illustrate how this has evolved how defense has evolved over the years, and how it's actually naturally progressing to allow us to be more creative in how we think and how we do things. If we step way back to 1990s, and these dates aren't exact, I'm sure they're kind of blurry in many cases, but I'm just kind of using a basic timeline here. So if we look back at in the 1990s, we first, we were very immature in terms of security controls. There wasn't as many threats on the internet, one could argue, but we basically had firewall and antivirus. And so what that involved was you had a program and you installed it, and the antivirus would update, and there wasn't really much you could do to make it better or to make it more effective. You just essentially relied on the vendor to send you the updates for the antivirus patterns, and you need to make sure that the antivirus is deployed to all the workstations. So that wasn't very exciting. And of course, the firewall, it wasn't much different. You put this system in and it blocked ports, and you opened and closed ports. Not very exciting stuff if you look at how IT security is today, if you compare it to that. In the 2000s, we got introduced to IPS and security incident and event management. And IPS allowed us for a little bit more creativity. We could write our own signatures to detect malicious activity now. We didn't have to rely on the vendors to write signatures. But the reality of the situation was that not many people had the expertise or resources to write those signatures. So you found that maybe some people did write one or two signatures, but to a large respect, most of the time, everyone relied on the vendor signatures and used those. And of course, SIM, most people still talk about SIM today. If you saw our talk from 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks or a week ago, we still speak about SIM, and it's kind of founded in the 2000s, and the methodology was old. And even back then, it wasn't adopted well. it allowed for us to be creative, but most people didn't apply that thinking at that point. I think maybe we had the firewall antivirus thinking ingrained in our heads, so we started relying on the vendors to defend us and really help us defend, and it didn't allow us to be creative in that respect. And then in probably about 10 years ago, we got, it seems like a long time, but this is when these technologies were introduced. We got introduced to sandboxing, and this was essentially, instead of antivirus having a signature for bad programs, we now would analyze that program in real time, and if it was malware, we pick up based on certain types of behavior. Now, this was quite interesting because this didn't require signatures, but this did some analysis for us, and it allowed us to interpret the results of the analysis. So now we had the capability of looking at programs in real time and seeing if they did malicious things, and then we could take action there from there. So this really allowed us to not just switch boxes on and off and write signatures. Now we had a level of analysis that we could perform. And in 2012, we started seeing EDR type platforms hit the market. These are now very common, and many customers may have these. But this took it a step further. So instead of, I look at it like, instead of having a sandbox, a separate environment, we're doing that analysis in real time on the endpoints. So we even have greater flexibility, and it's easier for us to do that type of analysis. And it really makes it, it really gives us more power in terms of understanding what's happening on the endpoint. It allows us to analyze that to a greater effect. And basically, what I say that we need to get to is what I call defense engineering. So we're putting all these technologies together. We're combining different products, we're integrating them, we're automating them, and we're allowing our teams to work efficiently in terms of identifying threats and also remediating them and responding to them. And that's really the culmination of how all these technologies are becoming more flexible, and they're allowing us more creativity to really build a defense for our organizations. And we call this defense engineering. I'll be honest, it's not a term that I coined, and it's being used more and more, which is a great thing, I believe, because I think more people need to focus on doing this in their organization instead of just relying on vendors and the vendor technologies. So that's really...
Sorry, Martin. What EDR stands for?
EDR is Endpoint Detection and Response.
Okay.
There's a couple of different platforms like Cybereason, CrowdStrike, but you'll find now even even Microsoft has it. So that's why I say it's becoming more. It's more becoming a commodity. Where in 2012 it was very, I think, elite to have one. So yeah, you were very privileged to have this type of technology, and it was quite expensive. But now it's becoming more commonplace for customers to have that.
Okay.
So yeah, this is where I think that we need to get to defense, what we call in defense engineering. And I'm gonna, the next couple of slides, I'm gonna get a little bit technical, and we're gonna actually describe how we can use DNS for different, for offense and for defense. So, and this is a very base, most of you may understand what DNS is, but it's basically a service that translates a name. In this example here, I say google.com. When we use our computers, the computers don't necessarily know where google.com is. They need an IP address. And so the DNS changes or resolves that Google name to an IP address so that our computers can show us the web page or do whatever interaction. And we typically have a DNS server in our corporate environments, or our ISP might provide the DNS service. But I'm going to walk through how we can actually use DNS for offense and for defense. So first, I'm going to look at most people think is the interesting side and how we can use for DNS for offense. So, and these are actually common attacks that we see in environments, how attackers are using DNS to achieve certain things. And why do they think that DNS is a good thing? Why is it interesting for an attacker to use DNS? Firstly, there's not often security monitoring that takes place around DNS. So most people think of DNS as a very basic protocol that it's like a phone book. I mean, what harm can you do with a phone book? It looks up a phone number for someone. It's a good thing. It's information and it's not sensitive information. So why should we be concerned about it? And so for that reason, most people just allow it anywhere. So we don't block DNS lookups very often. And this is all good for the attacker because it means that they have any environment that they get to, they can pretty much be assured that this will be available to them to use. And here's the interesting part. Most organizations will have a DNS server in place that will do the DNS lookups for your internal network. It's almost like a proxy server. And 9 times out of 10, that is not audited, or there's no authentication. So we can do this lookups through this proxy server without authenticating. So when you start talking about these points, this is now sounding more and more attractive to the attacker because now he doesn't need to authenticate. He knows it's going to work. So it sounds like this is very easy to access. Now, what is he going to do with this now that he has access, pretty much unobliterated access to DNS? Well, he's going to use this for command and control and for data exfiltration. So it's quite easy and there's programs available to help for attackers use DNS to send commands through the channels and get data out of your environment using DNS. And it's really simple to do this. All they need to do is install a program somewhere on the internet. And then from there, they may need to register a domain. But then they can literally send commands into your network and exfiltrate data out of your network. And this all goes through these DNS mechanisms that have no auditing, no authentication, and are always allowed. And the interesting part about all this is when we're doing this, we're not exploiting any vulnerability. We're just making use of the systems that are in place for our systems to work. So if you do a vulnerability scan, you won't pick this up in your environment as a vulnerability. So when we start looking at the bigger picture here about how defense is used for offense, it starts looking pretty scary because we have all these where no controls available and all this functionality that can be done. And it's difficult for us to detect if this is actually happening. You can see why DNS is quite an attractive mechanism for offense for attackers to use. But we have some good news as well. We can also use it as defenders. And this is where we start talking about being creative. So let's see how we can use defense and what are some of the benefits of using DNS for defense. Firstly, we get instant enterprise-wide visibility. So many times when we deploy antivirus or a DLP agent, we need to actually go and install a program, or we need to install something on our gateway or enable something on the firewall. But for DNS, every system on your network is using DNS already. So we don't have to install anything. So for us to get visibility, all we need to do is tap into the DNS servers, and then we have instant visibility for the entire enterprise. And this really makes it easy to deploy this type of monitoring because we don't have to go and install agents. Another interesting aspect for us is that almost all activity requires a DNS lookup. So even if an attacker is on your network, many times they'll use a domain name instead of an IP address, so they still have to do that lookup. So in most cases, we'll be able to see that activity by the DNS systems if we're monitoring them correctly. And another thing is, if we are monitoring those and actually auditing those logs, we can actually detect data exfiltration and CNC traffic. So there's rules that we can implement to detect that kind of traffic, and it makes it quite interesting for us, because now we have instant enterprise-wide visibility, and all those bad things that the attackers are doing on the DNS traffic, we can pick that up. And another good thing about DNS is it's a great source for threat hunting and for investigations. So if we see malicious activity on a machine, if we have the capability to look at the DNS requests, so think about every telephone number that was dialed from that machine and in and around the time that that malicious activity happened, that could point us to some interesting information, and we can draw some conclusions around what actually happened. So from that perspective, it's a great source for intelligence when we're doing investigations. And again, we can also use it for threat hunting. One thing to point out here is that for a lot of this to work, we need to have a good control point or a single control point. And this is typically your DNS server. So in most cases, if your DNS is rolled out to best practice, this is already done. But for some customers that we monitor their DNS, we need to just change some things and close some ports so that machines can't look up DNS directly, that it goes through a single point. But this is fairly easy to do. So it's just something to note. It's not a big problem. So really, if you look at it, as much as the offense folks can use DNS, from a defense perspective, we also have many benefits in looking at DNS to help us defend. And this really points again to that concept that I'm talking about here in terms of defense engineering, thinking out of the box on how we can use existing things to help defend our organizations. So let me go through some pointers about DNS and DNS logs, and if we have auditing enabled, what do we look for? So we look for high entropy. So that's high volume of unique domains per subdomain, I would say, is a good way to look at that. And we often see this, many commercial products are actually being detected when we look for this entropy. And that means that we know our detection is working. As an example, many of the antivirus products now, they have a signature database, but they also need to look up in the cloud to see if a particular hash is malicious or not. So what we'll do with this, what they'll do with this is make a DNS request for that particular hash. And this really shows up because then all of a sudden we see a lot of DNS lookups for this particular domain or subdomain. So these are all things that we can look at. And when you do look at this, you actually see valid commercial applications, which is again a good sign because that means that you know that your queries are looking to actually find this malicious activity. Another thing that we look up is we baseline the TXT records. So I'm getting a little bit technical here, but basically DNS has different types of records. So most common associated is A records, which makes a Google point to, for instance, an IP address. But there are different types of records. TXT, for example, is actual text, and that's often used to do data exfiltration or for CNC commands. So we look for a baseline in that space for TXT records, and then we can compare that baseline. And if there's any variations, that helps us identify that type of malicious traffic. And again, it's just high volumes of lookups. This does become more challenging with the content delivery networks. They are using randomly generated subdomains, so but it still allows us to raise flags in certain circumstances to further investigate. Another thing that we need to do is zoom in on DNS responses that aren't no error. So in many cases, these tools that attackers use to do data exfiltration or CNC requests will generate many DNS errors. So if we see a spike in DNS errors or an increase in DNS errors events, then it's a good indication that something malicious could be going on there. So that's a good flag that we raised to further investigate. I mentioned in the previous slide that it's very important that we control the DNS lookups out of our network, not only for our visibility, but it's good to have this control point. So all your machines in your organizations should do DNS lookups using your internal DNS servers, which can then look up outside the network. So you want to have this single control point. It allows us to monitor easy, and it makes sure that we don't miss DNS requests that may go out directly. So that's an important thing to remember. Another thing that we found that was quite interesting to do with DNS queries is, for instance, if you're doing a penetration test on your internal network, many pen testers will launch, for instance, Kali Linux or maybe a vulnerability scanner. And those tools do a specific DNS lookup. So as soon as we see that lookup, we know that someone is running a program that's designed to either do a vulnerability scan or test your environment. And that's quite useful for us. We actually had a situation where one of our customers, our MDR customers, had a pen test done internal into their network, and literally they plugged their laptop in, and as soon as they started up their machine, those DNS lookups happened, and they hadn't even tried anything. And we found the customer who said, "Listen, there's something happening on your network." And the pen testers were like, how did you know this? How did you know this so quickly? So they're very, very useful to use that as well. And this is DNS over HTTPS is something that I've added onto the slide recently because there is a tendency, or there's many browsers and other applications are now using HTTPS for DNS lookups, which is for me a big risk because we lose visibility. But again, there are ways to mitigate this. You need to control your DNS lookups to a single source. And in many cases, for instance, Firefox by default now uses DNS over HTTPS. But in a corporate environment, you can disable that functionality. So that's maybe something to look at. We expect to have better visibility of DNS over HTTPS over the coming years as that support for that protocol is expanded into different products. But until then, you should be aware of that risk. So really, these are some pointers. And I think there's a lot we can do in terms of DNS. I think beyond this, there's a few other things that we can do. We're constantly learning about where we can look at DNS audit logs to find out if there's malicious activity on our networks. So to sum up my presentation, yes, we need to make cyber defense more creative, make it more interesting. We need to use the tools or tools similar to how the attackers are using it, and not rely just on our vendors to defend our networks. There was someone that had I think I would call it a pessimistic view of our jobs as cyber defenders, and the comment was made that hackers only need to get right once, and we as defenders, we need to get it right every time, because the hacker just needs to get through once, and then we've lost the game. But I like to look at it a little bit different, and I think this is how we need to change our thinking. Attackers always leave trails. Every time someone tries to get onto your network, if they are in your network, they will always leave a trail in the log files. And as defenders, we have many opportunities to detect those trails and to respond to those. And that gives a little bit more optimistic view of how we can defend our networks more effectively. And that's it. Short presentation. I don't know if there's been any questions.
Yeah, actually, we have several questions, Martin. Thank you very much for the presentation. First question we have is, what authentication method are good alternatives to security?
I'm assuming that this is referring to authentication for DNS. So there are changes to the DNS protocol to make it more secure and to force authentication. But there's not really anything mainstream. I think the best approach is to, there are some products that provide the DNS security, but again, it's not mainstream. And I don't feel that that will necessarily mitigate the problem sufficiently. So my advice there would be it's too early to adopt any type of DNS authentication. There are DNS encryption methods that are available. But really, it looks like we are more moving to DNS over HTTPS. This, to me, looks like the next move that DNS is going to happen. It's very similar to the IPv6 and IPv4 conversation. We've been talking about it for so long. DNS security has been around for so long, but we haven't seen mass migration to it. It's taking much longer than people expect, and I expect the same will happen with DNS.
Okay, perfect. It's another question that linked to this first one from the same person. 1 second. What about abuse of admin privileges in corporate when the attack is internal? I think we are talking about insider's threat.
Yeah, look, so I think if admin privileges are abused in a corporate, then DNS really can't help us much. But I think overall, that's a separate topic that we could actually talk about, and that's authentication logs and looking at authentication logs to find malicious activity, because that's where you would see that kind of activity. But definitely something that something that can be looked at more creatively than we traditionally look at. Traditionally, we'll look at applying privileged identity management, and these are all good concepts. But I still think that we need a layer underneath to monitor abuse of admin privileges in internal networks. It's definitely something that we are doing in our current with our current rules to look at this type of activity. But there's probably room for expansion on that, because as the attackers evolve, they use different tools. And we're seeing that many attacks that they are using the built-in tools, very similar to DNS. They're using PowerShell, etc. And they're not necessarily exploiting vulnerabilities to elevate privileges. So again, that's something that we need to monitor, and that should be monitored on the relevant log sources.
Great. We have another question. Does everyone who has access to Metaexploit is a hacker? I think this is more a generic question.
No, not necessarily. I used an example of Kali Linux, but Metaexploit is, pen testers use it, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they are a hacker. They're just auditing your tools, but for us, it's always useful to know when some tool like that is used on the network, because it's either one of two things. There's a pen test happening, which we want to know about, or there's a malicious actor on the network. So for us to know about that is quite good. And it's not something that generates lots of false positives when we alert on something like that. So yeah, absolutely. Not everyone that has access to Metaexploit is an evil person or a hacker. But for us, it's still good to know about that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Diraj, for the questions. One question from Anthony: is DNSSEC sufficient to prevent data exfiltration? Sorry.
Unfortunately not, and that's I think I touched on that just now on this topic about DNSSEC, and it's DNSSEC will allow you to kind of authenticate and encrypt DNS lookups, but it most certainly won't stop data exfiltration. And in some ways, it makes it more difficult, because if we don't, because DNS traffic is now encrypted, if we're not monitoring it correctly, then we can't have visibility of what's going through that encrypted stream. And so there's a risk that we may miss traffic that is exfiltrating data. So I think one has to look at it holistically. You can't just apply DNS sec and think, no, things are okay. There's still many other vulnerabilities that would exist there. And that's my view on that, Joe.
Makes sense. Thanks, Martin. Thank you, Anthony, for the question. A few more questions from Laurent. How far should we trust external DNS service providers like OpenDNS, Google DNS, Cloudflare, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. And really, the question about DNS over HTTPS comes up a lot, and I think in the last year, many of the people that are advocating privacy have raised concerns about the DNS providers like Google DNS, Cloudflare as well, that are now providing DNS over HTTPS. So they're saying that they're making your DNS request secure because it's encrypted. But the problem is that those companies now have a comprehensive listing of all the domains that you've accessed from your machine. So there are some privacy concerns there. Do you trust them? I think you must, that's a call that you need to make as an individual and as an organization. You have to be realistic though, because all your Google search history is there as well, and Google has access to that. So just because you're now giving them DNS access, I don't think that should make you not trust them. They're still the same organization that's doing all your searching for you, most probably, and has your Gmail and all that stuff. So I think one needs to look at it in context there as well. I take a personal view that if you have Gmail accounts and you use Google search, they have a certain level of data on you already. To me, it seems like many of these organizations do want to protect your data, but at the same time, their revenue is often very closely tied to understanding you as a person and your searching habits and what you're looking at, and all based to advertising revenue for them. So it's a bit of a conflict of interest there, if you will. But yeah, I don't have an answer for you there. I sound like a politician here, but I think it's important that people make that call themselves. But just understand that they have access to a lot of other information. So if you're just giving them the DNS on top of that, it's probably less informative to them than some of the other information that they already have.
Yeah, great. Still from Laurent, should DNSSEC be enforced in all companies now as a standard default for DNS protocol? And what about external pen testing against DNS? If IT implements DNSSEC, can this still be done?
Yeah, I definitely think that this should be done as a mechanism to test the DNS. So, and it's often overlooked, I feel. So many pen testers may not look at this as something that needs to be tested. But I think it would be good for pen testers to start testing this more aggressively. And even if there is DNSSEC, to test if data exfiltration can happen effectively, with DNSSEC. And then, as part of the pen test reports, go back to the customer and say, okay, we didn't find any vulnerabilities, but we actually were able to exfiltrate data via your DNS, and it appears that you didn't pick it up, just to make the customers aware that a mechanism exists that attackers can use. So definitely, I think that those protocols need to be tested, DNS and DNSSEC, however DNS is used in any case, should be tested as part of the test. And it can be done, to answer the question more directly.
Okay, this is all I have from my side. I don't know if there are more questions. Stefan, do you have any additional question?
Yes, the subject, of course, make me think about red team and blue team services. How do you see that, Martin? I mean, you think now a blue team contract is mandatory for a company on the red team also? What's your opinion?
Yeah, look, for me, I think that that's a very interesting. I never thought of it like that. That's actually interesting that you raise it like that. Look at it as a blue team contract, because we're quite. I think people are more familiar with the red team concept, and they're quite happy to get someone to do a red team exercise against them. But most people don't look at it from a defense perspective, to actually get someone to help them with their defenses. And for me, it certainly makes sense to do that, because the whole concept of defense engineering, as I've illustrated here, is not easy to do. It requires quite a bit of technical understanding of how systems work, and you need to have a general security mindset to apply some of that thinking that applies that DNS defense engineering speaks to. So yeah, that's an interesting point, and I do think that it's that it is something to look at for customers. For ourselves, we do work with customers that do red team exercises, and we perform as the blue team as well. Sometimes there's a conflict of interest. You can't do both. But sometimes customers are okay with that. They understand that there's transparency there. So yeah.
Okay, and I was wondering if there is an existing training for defense. You know, like for example, the CEH is a certified ethical hacker from ETC Council is a training. Do you know if there are defense training?
You know, there are. I would say that the only people that do the closest training to that is very specialized. It's not like a CEH. It's I think the people that come the closest to that is SANS. The SANS have quite a bit of training around threat hunting. But for us in South Africa, the SANS training is in euro, so it's very expensive. And I think even in euro, it's very expensive. So it's not something that we can look at. So it's really not there's no mainstream training on the side. There is maybe, for instance, analyst training for SOCs, but I don't really put that in the same category. So that is definitely a shortage of training in this space. And we're actually developing some of the analyst training, but if you talk about the concepts of defense engineering, it's quite an advanced subject that requires broad knowledge across IT systems. So it's difficult at the moment. We have to rely on experience around that for the people that are working in that.
Mm-hmm.
One more question.
Sorry. Do you have in your team people coming from the offensive side come to the defensive side?
Yeah, we constantly see that. I've seen it myself as people get more experience. And people that have worked with Offence for many years, I see that many of them tend to go to the blue side, so work more in defense. And I think because they are seeing that it's as challenging. Before, we just used to think, if I work on defense, I'm only going to configure a firewall or make sure the antivirus is updated. But actually, now with defense, we're able to write Python programs to help things work better together and to work the defenses more accurately, to do forensic investigations. So it's definitely more interesting, and I believe more challenging. It's more of a challenge to defend than attack an organization.
Great. Serge?
Yes. One more question. Two questions, sorry. From your side, what's best defense approach? Should it be more software-wise or hardware-wise? Seems very broad.
Yeah, so that's a good question, I think, because that's one of the ways we think about it. But I would actually go as far as saying that for us, the focus is not really on the software or the hardware, but more the actual approach and the human thinking about how we implement the defenses. So I think the hardware and the software line is, the hardware line is becoming, the thinking about hardware with virtualization is becoming less of a topic nowadays. And we're all just talking about software or virtualized hardware. So for me, I believe that we should focus on human intelligence and how that's applied. And I think the software is just tools to help us with that thinking. And then obviously the hardware is less of an issue. It's, whether it's virtualized or not. There are still companies that sell hardware security modules for storing keys and stuff like that. And there's maybe a use case for that. But definitely I would focus on the software, which is essentially the tools, but more so how we use those tools as people and defenders and using those optimized in an optimized manner.
Definitely. When you talk about threat hunting, is this something you can do without a platform that retains all the telemetry?
Yeah, we do. We do threat hunting, and it's really the concept of threat hunting is having lots of data available and being able to look through that data for malicious activity. So it really helps to have a platform to do that. You could probably do it without the platform, but realistically, you need that data, and you need, a lot of the log files are sometimes rotated on a daily basis now because there's so much log information. So if we don't have, at least a few weeks of data, then it becomes difficult to see any type of trends, and then the threat hunting becomes less effective. So it's not impossible, but it's really helpful, and it helps you become more efficient in your threat hunting when you do have some sort of platform to do that.
Great. You will be very happy with this one because I know your position on AI. Use of AI in defense engineering. Are we in the right direction?
I think, Serge, my viewpoint on this already. But quite. If you had a look at last week's presentation, we spoke about this, and my view is that artificial intelligence is nowhere near where it needs to be to help us as much as all the vendors are claiming. And I should point out that there is definitely a use for AI in helping us defend our networks. And in terms of it going in the right direction, yes, it's going in the right direction, but the road is still very, very long for us to get to a point where AI is actually in real time helping us detect and mitigate against attacks. At the moment, most of the AI is very basic use cases. We have now attackers also using AI to mitigate against the defense of AI, defenses that are using AI. And realistically, I see AI as more another tool to help us as defenders. But be cautious of listening to the vendors too much and them telling you that the AI is a silver bullet. I don't think it's nearly there. And all you have to do is look at some of the flops that we've seen in artificial intelligence. You all just need to, look at some of the adverts that get served to you. If you Google something, then you get something related to that. So, and really, this is all that AI is. It's it's making sense out of big chunks of data, and it is useful, but it's by no means the answer to all our problems at this point in time.
Perfect. No more questions from my side. I don't know if any one of you have more questions, guys. It's been very interesting to hear. Perfect. You're welcome, Anthony.
Great. I think we are reaching the end of this session. I put our emails in the chat for everybody, so feel free to contact us, especially if you want us to have a one-to-one meeting to answer more specific questions regarding your environments or customer needs. Martin, Serge, and I will be pleased to answer you and have a specific session with you. So don't hesitate to contact us. So thank you, everybody, to have attending this session, the second one. The replay will be shortly available, and I will send it to you by email for those who have attended the session.